Why do we win the lottery? Almost never, but even so we always feel that, this time it will work? That strange, almost automatic feeling that the improbable might finally happen. Have you ever experienced it? That sudden confidence, without numbers, without calculations, just a strong feeling saying that now is different. And the most curious thing, even knowing rationally that the chances are minimal, something inside us insists. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you, and perhaps change the way you understand your own decisions. The human brain loves certainty. It likes quick answers, simple conclusions, and stories that make sense. The problem is that probability doesn't work as a good story. She is cold, abstract, counterintuitive. Percentages, statistics, accumulated chances. None of that resonates well with a brain that evolved to survive in unpredictable environments, full of immediate threats. Our brain wasn't designed to calculate probabilities. It was shaped to react quickly, even if that meant making mistakes from time to time. And that's exactly where everything starts to go wrong. When we think about chance, risk, or possibility, the brain doesn't open a mental spreadsheet. It searches for emotional references, striking memories, personal experiences. A friend who won. A story they heard. An almost happened that stuck in their mind. Suddenly, what is statistically improbable begins to seem possible, familiar, even obvious. Have you ever noticed how extremely rare events seem much more common than they actually are? It's not a coincidence. It's the brain doing what it does best, transforming numbers into narratives. Throughout life, we learn to trust our intuition. And in many cases, it works. But when it comes to probability, this trust becomes a silent trap. The brain tends to overestimate rare events, underestimate real risks, and ignore data that doesn't evoke emotion. That's why we fear certain improbable situations more than much more common everyday dangers. That's why a sequence of coincidences seems like a sign. And that's why we feel that the odds are in our favor, even when they aren't. Perhaps you're thinking, but I know the chances are slim. Yes, you consciously know this. But the brain doesn't make decisions solely based on what you know. It decides based on what you feels, and feelings don't follow statistics. They follow impact, repetition, and meaning. A single emotionally powerful experience can outweigh 1,000 accurate data points. Have you ever experienced that? That feeling that something is going to work out even without a clear reason? The most intriguing thing is that this failure doesn't happen because we're bad with numbers. It happens because we're human. The brain prefers hope to chance, control to randomness, simple explanations to the discomfort of, it's impossible to predict. Instead of accepting that the world is full of uncertainties, it creates mental shortcuts. Shortcuts that work well for survival, but fail when we try to understand probability, risk, and real chance. And the more emotionally involved you are, the greater the tendency to make mistakes. Money, important decisions, expectations of reward, all of these activate ancient brain mechanisms, much more linked to survival than to logic. Without realizing it, we begin to treat possibilities as predictions and desires as evidence. The improbable ceases to seem improbable. It begins to seem next. But why does it happen exactly this way? What, within the brain, makes our intuition about probabilities so convincing, and so deceptive at the same time? Now, before we delve any deeper, pay attention to the next point, because it's here that this illusion begins to reveal itself. And the most curious thing of all is that this feeling isn't individual, shared. Everyone at some point has trusted their gut feeling more than the numbers. Has ignored a low probability because something inside told them it was worth a try. Has believed that chance was finally on their side. If this has ever happened to you, take a quick pause now and think. In what situation in your life has this intuition spoken louder than the data? Finances, important decisions, risky choices? If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below sharing what has resonated with you the most so far. Your experience could help many people who are watching in silence. This space isn't just for watching and leaving. It's a place for exchange. When you comment, you're not just reacting to the video, you're showing that this topic is part of your real life. And that creates something powerful: community. Different people with different stories, realizing that their brains work in very similar ways. So, if anything said so far made you think, this happens to me, write it down. Even if it's something simple. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. If this video has made you reflect in any way, consider giving it a like. It's not just an automatic gesture. It signals that this type of conversation matters, that discussing the mysteries of the human brain is worthwhile. This small support helps the video reach those who may be making important decisions without realizing how their own minds can be influencing everything. Now, if you enjoy content that explores scientific curiosities, strange brain phenomena, and those invisible flaws that shape our choices, subscribing to the channel is a way of saying, I want to continue understanding this here. The idea is to go beyond the surface, always using clear language without complicating what is already complex by nature. Stay with me because from here on out we're going to get to the heart of the problem, the exact point where the brain abandons numbers and starts trusting something far more dangerous than it seems. The central point of all this becomes clearer when we confront a truth that is almost never stated so directly. The human brain.it wasn't designed for thinking in percentages. It doesn't naturally work with abstract numbers, cumulative probabilities, or cold calculations. The brain works from stories. He interprets the world through narratives, concrete examples, mental images, and experiences that make emotional sense. And this difference completely changes how we assess risk, chance, and possibility throughout our decision-making journey. When someone says that the chance of an event happening is 0.001%, it rarely generates real impact. The number passes by but doesn't stick. It doesn't provoke emotion, doesn't create an image, doesn't awaken a memory. Now, just hearing the phrase, I know someone who won, is enough to instantly change everything. Suddenly, the improbable ceases to be abstract. It gains a face, a story, a context. The probability hasn't increased at all, but the feeling of possibility, it grows almost immediately. The brain doesn't ask itself if it's statistically relevant. It simply registers, it happened to someone. And that's enough to create a powerful internal narrative. This is one of the most important behind-the-scenes aspects of how the human mind works. The brain evaluates the world based on accessible examples, not on complete data. It doesn't rationally scan all possibilities. It looks for shortcuts, quick stories, memorable cases, associated emotions. This mechanism was extremely useful for survival throughout evolution, but it becomes a flaw when we try to deal with real probability. Because individual stories have an infinitely greater emotional weight than silent statistics that never attract attention. Think about it. Thousands of people don't win, don't succeed, don't achieve success in certain scenarios. But these stories aren't told, they don't go viral, they aren't recorded in the collective memory. They disappear. The brain doesn't easily register absences. It registers events. It registers exceptions. It registers what breaks the pattern. And, in doing so, it creates a distorted perception of reality. A single memorable case comes to represent something much bigger than it actually is. When someone says it's happened before, the brain interprets this as an indication of repetition, even if the event is extremely rare. It doesn't clearly differentiate between the actual frequency and the mere existence of a case. The fact that something happened once is enough for the mind to treat it as possible again. It doesn't matter if the chances remain minimal. The brain doesn't operate with precise statistical scales. It operates with meanings. And the meaning in this case is simple: it happened so it can happen again. This distortion creates a hidden truth that influences decisions every day. We come to feel that something is more likely simply because we can remember a specific example. Emotional memory takes control of risk assessment, while real mathematics takes a back seat, almost invisible. It's not a conscious choice. It's an automatic process. The brain relies on what is easy to remember, not what is most correct. And perhaps the phrase that best represents all of this is the one that arises silently, almost intimately: I feel like today is my day. This feeling doesn't stem from data or calculations. It arises from emotional state, from mood, from desire, from expectation. The brain mixes internal factors, confidence, anxiety, hope, tiredness, and constructs a coherent narrative. Today seems different. Today seems special. Today seems promising. There are no statistics involved. There is feeling. And when emotion and statistics clash, emotion almost always wins. This doesn't mean we are naive, weak, or irrational. It means we are human. Our minds were shaped to interpret the world subjectively, not mathematically. The brain prefers a good story to a cold truth. It prefers meaning to precision. It prefers the illusion of control to the discomfort of chance. When it doesn't find a clear explanation, it creates one. Even if it's fragile. Even if it's illusory. Even if it completely distorts the real probability of events. This trend affects much more than games or bets. It impacts financial decisions, career choices, relationships, investments, life changes, and even how we interpret everyday risks. The transformation begins when we realize that many of our convictions did not arise from reliable data, but from internal narratives that seem true because they make emotional sense. This is a crucial point in the journey of self-knowledge. Understanding that feeling certain is not the same as being right. The impact of this perception is profound. We begin to defend these narratives as if they were facts. We ignore information that doesn't fit them. We reinterpret uncomfortable data. We justify risky choices with well-told stories within our own minds. The brain doesn't ask, what is the real chance of this working out? It asks, does this fit with the story I'm telling myself? If it fits, the decision seems safe. If it doesn't fit, the numbers are discarded or minimized. This is how we build a sense of confidence based much more on internal coherence than on external reality. This is one of the most important revelations when we talk about probability, mindset, and human behavior. The mind does not seek objective truth. It seeks emotional stability. And often, this means distorting the perception of risk to preserve hope, motivation, or a sense of control. The greater the emotional involvement, the greater this distortion tends to be. Expectation of gain, fear of loss, desire for change, need for validation. All of this fuels internal narratives that make the improbable seem plausible. The brain begins to act like an experienced storyteller, connecting points that make emotional sense, even when they don't make statistical sense. It transforms coincidences into signals, exceptions into rules, feelings into evidence. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding that the brain thinks in stories is only the beginning. What really changes everything is realizing how it confuses chance with pattern, repetition with signal, and coincidence with meaning. It is at this point that the failure to perceive probability becomes even more powerful, and much more invisible, influencing important decisions without us even realizing it. Before we continue, leave a simple sentence below, just so I know this resonated with you. Comment below, this makes sense to me. There is a silent moment when the brain begins to distort reality without asking permission, and this moment becomes more pronounced when we deal with rare events, things that, from a statistical point of view, happen very rarely end up seeming much more common, frequent, and closer than they actually are. And this doesn't happen because we are poorly informed or incapable of understanding numbers, but because the brain doesn't measure risk the way we imagine. It doesn't accurately calculate real frequency. It measures emotional impact, and impact always weighs more than silent repetition. Consider the classic example that almost everyone has experienced, the fear of flying. Most people rationally know that traveling by plane is much safer than driving a car every day. The data is clear, consistent, and widely publicized. Even so, the discomfort of boarding a plane is usually much greater than getting into a car on a busy road. This happens because plane crashes are rare but extremely shocking. They involve strong images, dramatic stories, intense media coverage, and a very high emotional charge. The brain registers this impact as something gigantic. Car accidents, although much more frequent, are part of everyday life. They don't cause the same emotional shock. And, for the brain, what shocks more automatically seems more dangerous. This is one of the most important behind-the-scenes aspects of human risk perception. The brain doesn't ask, how many times does this happen? It asks, how much did this affect me? The more intense the emotion associated with an event, the more space it occupies in memory. And the more space it occupies in memory, the more common it seems. Actual frequency ceases to be the main criterion. Emotional impact takes control of the internal narrative. This is how something extremely rare begins to seem close, possible, almost imminent. News reports powerfully amplify this phenomenon. When a serious accident, a rare disaster, or an unusual tragedy occurs, it is repeated countless times from different angles with analyses, interviews, images, and reconstructions. The brain is exposed to the same story repeatedly in a short period of time. And, without realizing it, it begins to interpret this repetition as frequency. The mind confuses the repetition of information with the repetition of the event. It is not the event that is repeating itself, but the narrative about it. But the brain does not make this distinction clearly. This confusion creates a hidden truth that influences decisions every day. We begin to overestimate rare risks and underestimate common ones. What happens frequently but doesn't generate emotional impact goes unnoticed. What happens rarely but provokes fear, shock, or indignation gains disproportionate weight. This distortion changes how we assess danger, safety, and probability, affecting everything from simple daily choices to decisions that shape an entire life journey. When we see shocking news, the brain activates ancient mechanisms linked to survival. It interprets that information as a warning, something that needs to be avoided, something that deserves immediate attention. This emotional alert doesn't come with a cold or statistical analysis. It comes loaded with fear, urgency, and a sense of threat. The mind then quickly generalizes, if this happened to someone else, it could happen to me. If it could happen to me, it's dangerous. If it's dangerous, I need to avoid it. The emotional logic closes itself, creating a sense of internal coherence that dispenses with numbers. The problem is that this logic ignores proportion. It doesn't differentiate between the exceptional and the common. It only reacts to what seems threatening. And the more threatening something seems, the more space it occupies in our perception. Gradually, we begin to make decisions based more on what scares us than on what actually poses the greatest risk. This transformation happens subtly, almost invisibly, as part of the automatic way the brain interprets the world. This same mechanism also works with personal stories. A powerful account heard from someone close can have more impact than thousands of accurate data points. If someone recounts a traumatic, unexpected, or very intense experience, the brain registers it as highly relevant. It trusts what is vivid more than what is statistically correct. Numbers are abstract. Stories are concrete. And the concrete always wins the battle for mental attention. This is one of the most important revelations when we talk about probability and decision-making. The more intense the emotion associated with an event, the more likely it seems. Fear, shock, surprise, and indignation act as mental multipliers. They amplify the perception of risk even when the real risk is minimal. The brain begins to act as if it were protecting itself from something imminent, when in fact it is reacting to an emotionally charged narrative. This confusion between impact and frequency profoundly shapes behaviors, choices, and beliefs. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why rare events seem more common than they are is only part of the journey. The next step is to understand how the brain transforms this distorted perception into patterns, signals, and conclusions that seem logical but stem from an emotional interpretation of reality. It is at this point that the mind begins to see meaning where there is only chance, and this completely changes how we deal with risk and probability. Before we continue, leave a comment below with a word that represents how you felt when you realized this. Write this down: impact. There is a classic error that cuts across virtually all cultures, ages, and levels of knowledge, and it stems from a deep discomfort the brain feels in the face of randomness. The human mind simply hates the idea that things happen without reason, without order, without intention. Chance is unsettling. It takes away the sense of control, challenges internal logic, and creates a feeling of vulnerability. That's why, when faced with random events, the brain does something almost automatic. It tries to find a standard even when that pattern doesn't exist. This search for logic where there is only chance is one of the quietest gears in the failure to perceive probability. The brain doesn't easily accept that independent results remain independent. It prefers to believe that there is a sequence, a trend, a hidden balance being restored. This is where that common thought comes from: it came up red several times, now it's going to come up black. The roulette wheel has no memory, but the brain does. And this memory creates a false narrative of compensation, as if chance needed to correct itself. The problem is that reality doesn't work that way. Random events don't owe anything to each other. The fact that something has happened several times in a row doesn't alter the probability of the next event, but the brain intuitively refuses to accept this. It senses that something is wrong with long sequences, as if the universe were exaggerating. This feeling doesn't come from mathematics, it comes from perception. The brain expects constant variation, alternation, visible balance. When this doesn't happen, it interprets it as a signal. And then another powerful phrase emerges: this can't be a coincidence. Whenever something repeats itself, whenever apparent patterns emerge, the brain goes on alert. Coincidence is an uncomfortable explanation because it offers no control, purpose, or predictability. So the mind does what it knows best: it constructs meaning. It connects the dots, creates causal relationships, and transforms random events into signals laden with intention. This is one of the greatest hidden truths about how we think. This tendency is linked to something very deep in our journey as a species. Finding patterns was essential for survival. Identifying cycles, recognizing recurring threats, predicting environmental behavior, all of this saved lives. The problem is that the same mechanism that protected us in the past now deceives us in contexts where randomness is real. The brain continues to apply the same old logic in situations that would require statistical, not intuitive, thinking. When chance enters the scene, the mind tries to tame it. It transforms randomness into narrative. A sequence becomes a trend. A coincidence becomes a sign. An isolated event becomes proof. And the more emotionally involved a person is, the stronger this illusion becomes. The brain begins to act as if it were deciphering a code hidden behind events, when in reality, it is merely reacting to its own need for control. This need is central to understanding this error. Human beings need to feel they have some control over what happens. Absolute chance generates anxiety, insecurity, and a feeling of powerlessness. So the brain creates a pattern-reading mindset, even if it leads to misguided decisions. It's more comfortable to believe there's an invisible logic than to accept that certain things simply happen for no reason. This mechanism influences financial decisions, bets, investments, career choices, and even relationships. When something goes right several times in a row, the brain assumes there's a formula. When something goes wrong repeatedly, it creates causal explanations, even if the events are unrelated. The mind constructs narratives to protect its sense of control. This is a silent transformation in how we interpret the world. What's most intriguing is that the more intelligent a person considers themselves, the more sophisticated this narrative can be. The brain doesn't abandon the search for patterns, it merely refines it. Instead of simple phrases, elaborate explanations, complex theories, and convincing justifications emerge. All to avoid facing the possibility that chance has no commitment to justice, balance, or meaning. This confusion between chance and pattern also explains why many people see signs in completely random sequences. Repeated numbers, seemingly aligned events, unexpected encounters. All of this can be interpreted as a message, destiny, or confirmation. The brain prefers to believe it is being guided by something greater than to accept that randomness is part of the structure of reality. This interpretation provides comfort, but distorts the perception of probability. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why the brain creates patterns where none exist is only the tip of the iceberg. What truly changes how we make decisions is realizing how this need for control influences important choices, reinforces false beliefs, and sustains a sense of certainty that is not based on facts, but on carefully constructed internal narratives. Before we continue, leave a simple sentence in the comments that represents this moment of realization. Write this down: that wasn't a coincidence, or was it? There is an extremely sensitive point in this journey of understanding the brain that often goes almost unnoticed, but which profoundly and constantly influences decisions. The moment when personal experience is starting to carry more weight than any available data. This is where the mind takes a step beyond simple intuition and enters even more compelling territory, because now it is not only dealing with third-party stories, distant statistics, or cold numbers, but with something that seems unquestionable, what has been experienced firsthand. For the brain, direct experience is not just another piece of information. It is a memory laden with emotion, context, bodily sensation, and identity. When someone says, "This has never happened to me," this phrase doesn't come across as a neutral observation. It sounds like a solid, almost definitive conclusion. The brain interprets this experience as sufficient proof to invalidate thousands of statistics that say otherwise. After all, if it hasn't happened to me until now, why would it? This logic doesn't originate from mathematics. It originates from memory. This is one of the most powerful behind-the-scenes aspects of human error in measuring probability. A single lived experience has the power to overcome thousands of impersonal statistics. Data is abstract, distant, and doesn't evoke clear images or intense emotions. Personal experience, on the other hand, is concrete, vivid, and easily accessed mentally. Comes with memories, sensations, and details. The brain trusts much more in what it can relive internally than in graphs that don't awaken any real feeling. When someone says, "It's always worked this way," that phrase carries much more than it seems. It carries a narrative built over time, reinforced by selected memories. The brain doesn't register everything in a balanced way. It doesn't store all attempts, all near misses, all the variables involved. It mainly registers what confirmed the story it was already telling. And this selection isn't conscious. It's automatic. It's a way to protect internal consistency and reduce the discomfort of uncertainty. Memory, contrary to what we like to believe, is not a faithful archive of reality. It is a constant reconstruction. Every time we remember something, we reinforce certain details and weaken others. The brain does this strategically, even unconsciously, prioritizing memories that sustain the feeling of control and consistency. If a decision was successful several times, these victories gain prominence. If it was unsuccessful but without great emotional impact, these failures tend to disappear over time. Gradually, personal experience becomes a highly convincing, albeit profoundly distorted, proof. This is how many decisions end up being made. Not based on real probability but based on internal narratives like, "It always worked for me so it should continue to work." The brain transforms experience into a general rule. It ignores sample size, ignores external factors, ignores changes in context, and ignores the role of chance. Personal experience becomes a rigid filter. All new information must pass through it. If the data contradicts memory, the data is discarded or minimized. This mechanism helps explain why statistical warnings often fail. When someone presents large numbers, population averages, percentages, or projections, the brain compares all of this with its own history. If personal experience doesn't confirm that data, an internal conflict arises. And in this conflict, memory almost always wins. Not because it's more accurate, but because it's more familiar. Familiarity generates comfort. Comfort generates confidence. And confidence sustains decisions. This process shapes mindset, choices, and behaviors throughout life. It influences financial decisions, health habits, career choices, relationships, and even how we deal with everyday risks. "It's never happened to me before" becomes a kind of psychological shield against the possibility of error. "It's always worked this way" becomes a powerful justification for repeating decisions, even when the scenario has completely changed. The brain prefers continuity to adaptation because continuity provides a sense of security. There is also a profound identity aspect to all of this. Personal experiences help build who we believe ourselves to be. When someone questions these experiences using external data, it doesn't just sound like a technical disagreement. It sounds like a threat to identity. The brain reacts defensively. It protects its own narrative because accepting the numbers would mean accepting that its own reading of reality might be wrong. And admitting that generates discomfort. So the mind does what it knows best. It discredits the data and reinforces the internal story. This is a hidden truth that is difficult to face. Many of our strongest certainties are not based on broad analyses or real probabilities, but on tiny samples of life itself. Yet, these certainties seem solid, almost unshakable. The impact of this is enormous, because important decisions begin to be guided by selective memories, not by statistics. The brain trusts what it remembers more than what is mathematically most probable. This distortion creates a deceptive sense of logic and consistency. The mind looks back, organizes events coherently, and constructs a narrative where everything seems to have made sense all along. Chance is smoothed over, deviations are forgotten, and mistakes are reinterpreted. Personal experience is transformed into a well-told story, and well-told stories are extremely persuasive to the brain itself. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why personal experience deceives more than data is only part of the revelation. The next step is to realize how the brain exaggerates successes, minimizes failures, and creates a sense of continuous control, even in environments dominated by uncertainty and chance. That's where the flaw in probability perception becomes even more subtle, and even more powerful. Before we continue, leave a simple sentence in the comments that represents this moment of awareness. Comment below, "My experience deceived me." There is a particularly powerful illusion in the way the brain deals with probability, and it manifests itself at the moment when something almost did happens. It didn't actually happen, it didn't materialize, it didn't become reality, but it came close enough to provoke an intense emotional reaction. And for the brain, this almost isn't neutral. It's interpreted as a sign of proximity, as if the result were right there, about to happen. It's at this point that the mind begins to confuse error with progress. When someone says, "I almost made it," that phrase doesn't carry the weight of a complete failure. On the contrary, it sounds like a confirmation of potential. The brain interprets the near miss as evidence of ability, as if the system were working and just needed one more try. "It was so close" doesn't sound like defeat, it sounds like fine-tuning. And "next time it will work" stems from this emotional interpretation that the path is already right, even when the results continue to be, objectively, mistakes. This is one of the most subtle and impactful revelations about how the human mind works. Statistically, almost getting it right is exactly the same as getting it wrong. There is no such thing as half a success when we talk about probability. The event either happened or it didn't. The result was achieved or it wasn't. But emotionally, the brain doesn't accept this equivalence. It creates a subjective hierarchy where "almost" occupies a very different place from "didn't even come close." Almost seems like progress. And progress generates hope. This illusion occurs because the brain doesn't just evaluate end results. It evaluates sensations of the journey. When something almost works out, the mind feels it's making progress, even if, in practice, it isn't. The brain confuses perceived proximity with a real increase in probability. It interprets the almost as a sign that the odds are improving when, statistically, nothing has changed. Each attempt remains independent of the previous one, but the internal narrative ignores this. This mechanism has a huge impact on the decisions we make throughout life. It sustains poorly calculated persistence, prolonged gambles, emotional insistence, and choices that seem rational on the surface but are guided by a distorted reading of progress. The brain clings to almost because almost hurts less than accepting complete failure. It preserves the feeling of competence, of control, of continuity in the journey. There is also a profound motivational component involved in this. The near miss activates brain systems linked to reward, even without actual reward. It's as if the brain is saying, "You're close, keep going." This activation creates a feeling of momentum, energy, and positive expectation. The problem is that this emotional response is not accompanied by a statistical reassessment. The brain doesn't recalculate the odds. It only reinforces the narrative that it's on the right track. This is a hidden truth that is difficult to perceive while we are immersed in the experience. The phrase, "almost made it," sounds like learning, like course correction, like strategy refinement. But often, it's just chance creating an illusion of progress. The mind transforms a random variation into a sign of improvement. It constructs meaning where there is no real evidence of advancement. And the more emotionally involved a person is, the stronger this illusion becomes. This logic appears in countless contexts. Financial decisions, personal projects, career choices, relationships, repeated attempts to achieve a specific result. The brain views almost as a promise. It feels like it's accumulating something when, in reality, each attempt remains a new, independent event. The math says one thing. Feeling says another. And once again, emotion wins. The most curious thing is that the brain rarely makes the opposite move. It almost never interprets a distant mistake as a sign that something needs to be abandoned immediately. But it interprets the almost as confirmation that it's worth persisting. This creates a powerful asymmetry in decision-making. The close call receives disproportionate weight, while the "it didn't work" is softened, relativized, reinterpreted. This process shapes mindset over time. The person begins to trust more in the feeling of proximity than in the cold analysis of results. The impact of this accumulates. Small illusions of progress build great internal stories of persistence, even when the data would indicate caution or a change of course. The journey becomes guided by the narrative of almost, not by objective reality. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding the illusion of almost happened is only one part of the process. What truly transforms how we view decisions and probabilities is realizing how the brain uses this almost as emotional fuel, reinforcing expectations, sustaining beliefs, and creating the feeling that the outcome is always just ahead, even when it isn't. Before we continue, leave a short sentence in the comments that represents this perception. Write this down: "I thought I was close." There's a very specific reason why betting, gambling, casinos, and even certain marketing strategies work so well, and it has absolutely nothing to do with a lack of intelligence. Brilliant, rational, experienced, and informed people fall for these same mechanisms every day. This happens because these systems aren't built to deceive conscious logic, but to communicate directly with it. Structural limitations of the human brain: they don't confront reason. They circumvent reason by exploiting the very natural flaws in how we perceive probability, risk, and reward. When someone enters a betting environment, nothing there is random by chance. The colors, the sounds, the near misses, the small victories, the success stories displayed selectively, everything is designed to feed specific mental narratives. The brain isn't being tricked by simple schemes. It's responding to stimuli that exploit how it has been shaped throughout evolution. The system understands that emotion, expectation, and a sense of control have far more impact than cold numbers. Casinos know, for example, that almost won is more powerful than lost badly. They know that small, intermittent rewards keep the brain engaged longer than large, predictable rewards. They know that the feeling of progress sustains decisions that, rationally, would not hold up. This is not improvisation. It is the result of decades of study on human behavior, decision-making, and emotional responses to risk. And it's not just the game itself that matters, but the narrative the brain constructs while playing. Each attempt becomes a story. Each near miss becomes a signal. Each small victory becomes confirmation. The brain interprets all of this as evidence that it is learning, adapting, getting better. Even when the actual probability remains exactly the same. The system doesn't change, but perception does. And perception is what guides behavior. This same principle appears outside of casinos in a much more subtle way. Marketing strategies use exactly the same triggers. Promotions that expire soon, limited offers, isolated success stories, phrases like "thousands have already succeeded." All of this resonates with the brain's tendency to overestimate exceptions and transform individual stories into general rules. It doesn't matter how many people didn't have the same result. The brain fixates on the narrative that generates hope and a sense of opportunity. The most important point here is to understand that this doesn't happen because someone is weak, naive, or unprepared. It happens because the human brain didn't evolve to deal with artificial environments that deliberately manipulate probability. It evolved for natural environments, where real patterns had real meaning. When that same brain enters systems designed to simulate patterns, create illusions of control, and exploit the almost, it responds exactly as it was programmed to respond. This is a hidden truth that many people avoid facing. Knowing the numbers isn't enough to neutralize the emotional effect. You can rationally know that the odds are unfavorable and still feel it's worth trying one more time. You can understand statistics and still feel that, now it's different. Because the brain doesn't make decisions based solely on information. It makes decisions based on immediate emotional experience. This structural limitation explains why highly skilled people make risky decisions that, from an outsider's perspective, seem inconsistent. It's not inconsistency. It's the brain operating within its own shortcuts. It reacts to stimuli that promise control, continuity, and immediate reward. And the more emotionally involved a person is, the more these shortcuts dominate the decision-making process. The impact of this goes far beyond the game or consumption. It shapes mindset. It influences how we deal with financial risk, professional opportunities, and long-term decisions. The mind learns to trust more in the feeling of being close to success than in the cold assessment of reality. This transformation happens gradually, as part of the journey of exposure to these systems. Nothing seems abrupt. Nothing seems wrong. Everything seems reasonable within the narrative constructed by the brain itself. The most intriguing thing is that these mechanisms work better the more we believe we are in control. The feeling of choice, of active decision-making, of autonomy reinforces the illusion. The brain prefers to believe it is deciding freely when, in practice, it is responding to stimuli designed to provoke specific responses. This revelation often generates discomfort because it challenges the image we have of ourselves as entirely rational agents. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding how betting, gambling, and risk-taking exploit this brain flaw is only the beginning. The next step is understanding how the brain justifies these decisions after they've already been made, creating explanations that preserve self-esteem, coherence, and a sense of intelligence, even when the results don't confirm the initial narrative. Before we continue, leave a comment below with one word that represents what has caught your attention the most so far. Write this down: limitation. We have now arrived at the most delicate point of this entire journey, the final conflict between intuition and reality. This is where everything comes together. On one side, what we feel with strength, conviction, and familiarity. On the other, cold numbers, uncomfortable probabilities, and truths that offer no comfort. The brain sits right in the middle of this dilemma, trying to decide whom to trust. And almost always, it chooses what hurts less. Trusting intuition feels natural. It's quick, accessible, intimate. It arises effortlessly, without calculation, without the need for technical explanation. Intuition gives the feeling that we are connected to something greater, as if there were an invisible logic guiding our decisions. When we follow what we feel, we experience a powerful inner coherence. Everything seems to make sense even if we don't know exactly why. This feeling is comfortable. It reduces anxiety. It preserves self-esteem. It creates a sense of control. But numbers don't do that. Numbers don't comfort. They don't offer hope. They don't concern themselves with expectations or desires. They merely describe probabilities, often showing that what we want to believe is improbable, distant, or simply false. Accepting cold numbers requires a specific type of emotional maturity, the ability to cope with uncertainty, frustration, and limitations. And the human brain doesn't like that. It prefers narratives that alleviate the discomfort of chance. This is the crux of the conflict. Intuition promises meaning. Statistical reality offers randomness. Intuition says, trust me, it will work out. Mathematics says, it might work out, but it's unlikely. Between these two voices, the brain tends to choose the one that preserves hope. Because hope keeps the momentum going, keeps the motivation alive. It keeps the feeling that the journey has purpose. Realism, on the other hand, often sounds like giving up even when it isn't. There is a hidden truth here that is rarely stated clearly. The brain does not seek truth above all else. It seeks emotional balance. If the truth threatens this balance, it is softened, reinterpreted, or ignored. Not out of malice, not out of ignorance, but out of self-preservation. Accepting that chance governs much of reality is deeply uncomfortable. It means admitting that effort does not guarantee results, that merit does not ensure success, and that control is often an illusion. That's why hope becomes so seductive. It creates a bridge between desire and possibility, even when that bridge is fragile. Intuition acts as an emotional buffer. It protects us from the raw impact of actual probability. When the brain chooses to trust feeling instead of calculation, it's not being irrational, it's being human. It's prioritizing emotional continuity over statistical precision. This conflict appears in decisions both big and small. Investments, career changes, relationships, bets, personal projects. How many times have we followed something because it seemed right, even without solid evidence? How many times have we ignored data because it contradicted an internal expectation? The brain constructs elegant justifications for these choices, creating narratives that make everything seem logical after the fact. This subsequent reconstruction reinforces confidence in intuition, even when the results do not confirm the decision. There is also an important social component. Culturally, we value stories of those who followed their heart and succeeded. These stories are celebrated, shared, and amplified. Stories of those who followed their intuition and failed rarely gain prominence. This creates a powerful collective bias. The brain absorbs these narratives and begins to associate intuition with authenticity, courage, and success. Statistics, on the other hand, are seen as cold, pessimistic, and limiting. This association profoundly influences our mindset. Statistical realism demands accepting limits. It demands accepting that not everything depends on us. It demands recognizing that many variables are beyond our control. To the brain, this sounds like a loss of power. Intuition, on the other hand, restores that feeling of power. It says you feel it, therefore you know it. Even when that's not true. Even when the feeling is merely a reflection of past experiences, momentary emotions, or intense desires. This dilemma is never definitively resolved. It accompanies us throughout life. At different points in our journey, intuition sometimes dominates and reality sometimes prevails. The problem arises when we confuse one with the other. When we treat sensation as evidence. When we interpret hope as probability. When we transform desire into prediction. At this point, the brain stops merely preferring comfort and begins to actively distort the perception of reality. The impact of this is profound because it shapes decisions that accumulate over time. Small choices guided by unquestioned intuition can lead to major consequences. Not because intuition is always wrong, but because it wasn't designed to deal with complex randomness. It was designed to react quickly in predictable environments, not to navigate artificial probabilistic systems full of exceptions and noise. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding this conflict between intuition and reality is only the tip of the iceberg. What truly transforms how we perceive our own decisions is realizing how the brain justifies choices after they've already been made, creating narratives that preserve hope, identity, and coherence, even when the results point to chance as the silent protagonist of the entire story. Before we continue, leave a simple sentence in the comments that represents this internal dilemma. Comment below, intuition or reality? When we honestly and deeply understand that the brain fails to measure probability, something begins to silently change within us. It's not an explosive or immediate change. It's a transformation of mindset, a shift in attitude towards our own decisions. Gradually, we begin to realize that many choices that seemed natural or obvious were, in fact, automatic responses to mental shortcuts, momentary emotions, and internal narratives that were never questioned. And this realization in itself changes the course of many things. We've come to realize that deciding isn't just about choosing between options, but also about recognizing the source of the sense of certainty that comes with each choice. When the brain misinterprets probability, it creates urgency where none exists, hope where the numbers suggest caution, and confidence where curiosity might be better. By understanding this, decision-making ceases to be an impulse and becomes a process. A little slower, perhaps, but much more conscious. This impact is clearly evident in financial decisions. How often does someone invest, bet, or risk money guided by isolated success stories, past experiences that worked out, or the feeling that now things are different? When this flaw in the brain comes into play, the real probability becomes invisible. But when this flaw is recognized, something changes. A pause occurs. An internal question. A more detached analysis. Not because the person has stopped feeling, but because they have begun to distrust their own excessive enthusiasm. The same applies to decisions involving risk. Changing careers, taking on a large project, accepting or rejecting an opportunity. Intuition is still present, but it ceases to be sovereign. It begins to share space with data, context, and a broader understanding of reality. The brain begins to understand that feeling confident does not mean the scenario is favorable, and that feeling fear does not mean the risk is high. This separation is subtle but powerful. In daily choices, this awareness also manifests itself. Small decisions accumulated over time shape habits, routines, and results. Eating something, postponing a task, insisting on one strategy, avoiding another. When the brain learns to recognize its own errors in interpreting probabilities, it becomes less reactive and more observant. The person begins to perceive internal patterns, not external ones. They realize when they are exaggerating a chance, overestimating a danger, or being carried away by an almost that seems like progress but isn't. This change doesn't transform anyone into a rational machine. Emotions continue to exist. Intuition still has value. What changes is the relationship with them. Instead of obeying automatically, the mind begins to engage in dialogue. A space emerges between feeling and acting. And this space is where better decisions tend to be born. It is there that impulse loses its power and consciousness gains a voice. There is an important revelation in this process. Accepting that the brain fails is not a sign of weakness, but of maturity. It is recognizing limits. It is accepting that the human mind was not made to perfectly handle statistics, chance, and randomness. And, precisely for this reason, it needs conscious tools to avoid being dominated by these flaws. This acceptance changes how we deal with past mistakes. Instead of guilt, understanding arises. Instead of rigidity, learning emerges. Throughout the journey, poorly calculated decisions cease to be seen merely as personal failings and begin to be understood as natural consequences of an imperfect cognitive system. This doesn't eliminate responsibility, but it brings clarity. Clarity about why we repeat certain behaviors. Why we insist on improbable paths. Why we confuse hope with real chance. This clarity opens space for choices more aligned with reality, without completely killing the dream. The impact of this extends to relationships, personal projects, and long-term goals. Many frustrated expectations stem from misinterpreted probabilities. We expect too much from unlikely situations. We ignore clear signs because they don't fit the internal narrative we've created. When this dynamic becomes visible, the person begins to adjust expectations. Not to become pessimistic, but to become more lucid. Understanding this flaw in the brain doesn't make life colder. On the contrary, it makes it more honest. Hope continues to exist, but not as a denial of reality. It learns to coexist with limits, with data, with uncertainty. And this coexistence is healthier than the constant illusion of control. The mind learns that it doesn't need to transform everything into a sign, a pattern, or a destiny to move forward. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding how this awareness translates into practical changes in daily life is where everything starts to take real shape. It is at this point that theory meets everyday life, and where small decisions reveal silent but consistent transformations in how you deal with risk, choice, and chance. Before we continue, leave a simple sentence in the comments that represents this change in perspective. Comment below, decide with more awareness. If you've made it this far, it's because this conversation resonated with you on some level, perhaps in relation to a recent decision or something you've been carrying with you for a while. So, if you'd like to leave a sign that you've been with me until the end of this journey, write a simple sentence in the comments, something like, "This message was for me." I do read, genuinely, and that helps maintain this space as a place for exchange, not just content. If this video made you think, reflect, or look at your choices with a little more awareness, liking it is a silent way of saying so. It helps the video reach other people who are also trying to better understand how their own minds work, and that connection is what gives meaning to all of this. And if you want to continue exploring these mysteries of the brain, these invisible flaws that shape our decisions without us realizing it, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to keep this conversation going. The idea here is always to delve deeper without complicating things, and to transform curiosity into clarity. There's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic. Click on it and continue watching. The journey gets even more interesting when the pieces start to fall into place.